Rufus Dane didn't knock. He never knocked. He shoved the door of the Wren farmhouse open, so hard the top hinge cracked loose from the frame, and he stood there in the morning light with his thumbs hooked into his belt like he already owned the place, because in his mind, he did. The woman inside spun around from the stove, a wooden spoon still in her hand, and the 5 children behind her went absolutely still. "Time's up," Rufus said. He smiled when he said it. That was the worst part. He pulled a folded document from his coat pocket and dropped it onto the kitchen table without looking at it, without looking at her, his eyes already moving around the room, the way a man's eyes move when he's taking inventory. "You've got until Friday to clear out. If this kind of story moves you, the ones about ordinary people who refuse to be broken, please take a moment right now to subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications so you never miss what comes next. Stories like this one don't just entertain. They remind us what people are made of when everything is stripped away. Hit the like button and drop a comment telling me the city and country where you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to Wyoming, 1889, and find out what happened when the wrong man rode up to the wrong woman's door. The morning Harlan Voss rode toward the Wren property, he wasn't thinking about the widow. He was thinking about the note, $900, signed in Silas Wren's unsteady hand 14 months ago. The ink had bled a little where Silas pressed too hard, the way nervous men always did when they were borrowing money they weren't sure they could pay back. Harlan had seen that kind of signature hundreds of times. He'd stopped feeling sorry for it years ago. He rode at an easy pace because there was no hurry. The farm wasn't going anywhere. The woman wasn't going anywhere. People in debt rarely did, until someone came to remind them that the calendar had a hard edge. His horse, a dark roan gelding named Stockton, picked his way along the rutted track that cut through the eastern grassland toward the Wren claim. It was June and the grass on either side had gone a pale, dry gold from 3 weeks without rain. The kind of summer that made livestock restless and creditors busy. Harlan wasn't a cruel man. He'd been told that by people who meant it as a compliment, and sometimes he thought they were right, and sometimes he wasn't sure what it meant at all. He paid fair wages. He kept his agreements. He didn't drink past the point of judgment. He had built his cattle operation from 40 head to nearly 3,000 over 17 years, and he had done it by understanding one thing clearly. Sentiment was not a business strategy. He had lent Silas Wren money because Silas had collateral 160 acres of decent farmland with a growing wheat crop and a functioning well. The loan had terms. The terms had passed. What happened next was just arithmetic. He came around a low rise and stopped. The farm was smaller than he remembered from the survey description. Or maybe it just looked smaller because it looked so worn. The fencing on the near pasture had been mended with wire of 3 different gauges, patched together in a way that suggested emergency rather than maintenance. The barn roof had been patched too, with boards that didn't match, dried to different shades of gray. The kitchen garden beside the house was serious and dense, and clearly tended by someone who knew what they were doing. But the house itself had one window with oilskin stretched over it where glass had once been. Harlan sat on Stockton for a moment and looked at all of this. Then he rode down. She came out of the house before he reached the yard. He hadn't expected that. Most people waited. They watched from windows or stood behind doors a little, buying themselves the extra seconds that didn't actually change anything. This woman came straight out, wiping her hands on a cloth tucked into her apron, and she walked toward him like she had somewhere to be. She was younger than he'd imagined, 25, maybe 27, with dark circles under her eyes that came from too many nights with too much worry. Her dress had been washed so many times the color had gone out of it and left a sort of gray-brown that might have been blue once. Her hair was pulled back in a knot she'd probably done in about 30 seconds that morning without a mirror. She was also, and this was not a thing Harlan intended to notice, striking in the particular way that exhausted and determined people sometimes were, not soft, not decorative, but alive in every line of her face. He dismounted. He didn't tip his hat because it wasn't that kind of call. "Mrs. Wren," he said. "Mr. Voss." She stopped about 8 feet from him and didn't move closer and didn't move back. "I know why you're here. Then we can keep this short. I'd like to talk to you. Talking doesn't change a debt date." "No," she said, "but it might change what happens next." Behind her, in the doorway of the house, 5 children had appeared. Not dramatically, they didn't crowd the door or make noise. They were just there, quiet and watching, The way children get when they've learned that adult conversations can determine what they eat and where they sleep. Harlan looked at them for 1 second and then made himself look away. Mrs. Wren, the wheat is nearly ripe. Her voice was steady. Not pleading, not angry. Just steady. The way a person sounds when they've rehearsed what they need to say until the emotion has been pressed out of it. You can see it from here. Another 10 days, maybe 12, and we harvest. I have a buyer already. I made arrangements last month with the Callaway grain operation in Dunmore. A buyer doesn't help you if you don't have the crop yet. That's why I'm asking for 10 days. You were supposed to have made partial payment 60 days ago. I know that. The 60 days was already an extension. I know that too. She didn't look away from him. My husband died in April. We had a difficult spring. I'm not offering you excuses. I know you didn't ride out here for those. I'm telling you where things stand. The wheat is there. The buyer is confirmed. I need 10 days. Harlan turned and looked at the field. She was right. The wheat was close. He could tell that much without being a grain farmer. The heavy heads were starting to bow. Not yet gold, but getting there. The way a fire gets before it catches. 10 days was probably accurate. He turned back. What happens if I say no? She looked at him without flinching. Then you take the farm, and 5 children lose their home. That's not my problem to carry, Mrs. Wren. I know it isn't. She paused. I'm not asking you to carry it. I'm asking you for 10 days. Something about the way she said it, not as a plea, not as a demand, but as a plain statement of what was needed, made Harlan slow down inside in a way he hadn't expected. He was quiet for a moment. Behind her, the oldest child, a girl with her mother's dark eyes and her mother's exact stillness, had come a step forward out of the doorway. 7 days, he said. Elowen Wren blinked. It was the first time he'd seen her expression move. 7, that's my offer. She thought about it for exactly 3 seconds. He counted because he was watching her. All right, she said. 7 days. He should have gotten back on Stockton and ridden home. He knew that. He had 24 things on his property that needed his attention, and a foreman who was reliable but not inspired. And there was absolutely no reason for Harlan Voss to stand in the yard of a widow's farm, with the sun climbing toward mid-morning and nothing in his hands. He unsaddled his horse. Elowen stared at him. What are you doing? She asked. Protecting my investment. By staying? If the crop fails or something goes wrong with the harvest, I want to know about it directly. Not a week later when there's nothing left to do. She studied him with an expression he couldn't read. It wasn't gratitude and it wasn't suspicion exactly. It was something more careful than either. There's no guest room, she said. I've slept in barns before. The barn roof leaks. Then I'll fix it. She opened her mouth and then closed it, turned and went back inside the house. The girl in the doorway looked at Harlan for a long moment with those dark, serious eyes and then disappeared too. Harlan led Stockton to the paddock, found the latch, and let himself in. He didn't examine why he'd done it. He was not given to self-examination. He told himself it was business, and mostly believed it, and he hung his saddle on the paddock fence and went to find out what needed doing on this farm. There was plenty. The east fence had 3 posts that had worked themselves loose over the winter and never been reset properly. Someone had tried to brace them with stones piled at the base, which worked for about a week and then didn't. Harlan found the post hole digger in the barn, dug the posts out, set them properly in fresh holes, and tamped the earth down until they didn't move when he put his shoulder against them. It took 2 hours. His hands blistered in one spot where the digger handle had a rough patch, and he didn't stop for that. The boy found him when he was halfway through the 3rd post. He was maybe 6, with straw-colored hair and a gap where his front teeth had been, and a look of absolute fascinated assessment on his face. He didn't say anything for a while, just watched. Harlan kept working. Are you going to take our house? The boy asked. Harlan looked at him. What's your name? Orrin. Orrin. Your mother and I have an agreement. 7 days. What happens after 7 days? We see where things stand. Orrin considered this seriously. Mama says agreements are important. Your mama's right. She also said you might be difficult. Harlan looked at the post. She said that? She said some businessmen are difficult even when they don't mean to be. She said it wasn't personal. That's a generous thing to say. Are you difficult? Harlan drove the post into the hole and started tamping. Probably, he said. Orrin seemed satisfied with that. He sat down on the fence rail nearby and watched and didn't ask any more questions for a while, which Harlan appreciated more than he would have admitted. Elowen brought food at noon, not an elaborate meal. It was bread and salt pork, and a hard-boiled egg, and a cup of something that was supposed to be coffee and mostly was, but she brought it out to where he was working, which he hadn't expected. She set it on the fence rail, without ceremony, and stood back. "You didn't have to fix those posts," she said. "They needed doing. That's not the same as you having to do them." He looked at her. She was right, and they both knew it. He didn't answer. She sat down on the upturned bucket she'd brought out with her, and watched him eat with the particular look of a woman, calculating something. "You've been doing this a long time," she said. "Collecting. I've been running a cattle operation for 17 years. This is a part of it. But you do the collecting yourself. Yourself. Men like you usually send someone." He thought about that. "I find it's cleaner that way." "Cleaner," she repeated, like she was tasting the word. "People behave differently when the actual person is there. Less likely to make promises they can't keep. Less likely to be lied to about the situation. Are you worried I'd lie to you?" "I wasn't, but I didn't know that until I got here." She looked at him steadily. "And now? Now I know the wheat is real and the buyer is probably real, and you're not the kind of woman who makes things up. How do you know that?" He gestured at the kitchen garden without thinking. The dense, careful rows, the companion planting, the nothing wasted order of it. "Because people who make things up don't keep a garden like that. That garden is honest." Elowen looked at it. Something shifted in her face that she controlled quickly. "Silas wasn't a farmer," she said quietly. "He wanted to be. He had ideas." But she stopped. "You did it." "Yes, while he borrowed money." She didn't answer that directly. "He wasn't a bad man. He was a man who found things harder than he expected and didn't always make good decisions when he was frightened." She paused. "I don't say that to excuse the debt. The debt is real and it's owed, and I intend to pay it." "I know you do." "Then we understand each other." "I think we might," he said. That evening, Harlan slept in the barn. The roof leaked in 2 places, one of them directly above where he'd laid his bedroll. But he moved the roll and didn't complain because there was no one to complain to, and complaining wouldn't have fixed anything anyway. He lay there in the dark, listening to the sounds of the farm settle, the cow shifting in her stall, the distant sound of wind across the wheat field, the faint noise from the house where a child had woken briefly and been settled back down, and he thought about the garden. He thought about it for longer than made sense. In the morning, Elowen found him on the barn roof before she'd started the cook fire. He'd been up since first light with a hammer, and some boards he'd found stacked in the back of the barn, nailing the worst of the gaps shut. She stood below and looked up at him. "You didn't sleep well," she said. "I slept fine. There's a leak above the south corner." "There was." "Fixed it 20 minutes ago." She was quiet. Then, "Breakfast is in an hour. I'll be down." She went back toward the house, and Harlan kept hammering, and he thought that this was the strangest business call he'd ever made in 17 years of cattle ranching. The days settled into a rhythm that surprised him. He had not expected a rhythm. He'd expected to be an observer, a presence that kept things honest. Instead, he found himself waking before anyone else, and finding work before breakfast, and after breakfast finding more work, and after supper finding still more. Because on a farm being worked by one adult woman with 5 children, there was always more. He rehung the broken fence gate. He sharpened every blade in the place, scythe, axe, the small hand sickle Elowen used in the garden on the whetstone he found hanging on a nail in the barn. He repacked the wagon wheels with grease, because 2 of them were running dry and would have failed badly at exactly the wrong moment during harvest. Elowen watched all of this without comment and without excessive thanks. She said thank you once, plainly for the fence gate, and then did not say it again, and he found he respected that more than he'd have expected. The children recalibrated to him one by one. The oldest girl, Tessa, was 8 and serious and had already decided to be suspicious of him on principle. She did not warm up quickly, but on the 3rd day she brought him a tin cup of water while he was splitting wood, set it on the chopping block without a word, and walked away. He understood that was as close to acceptance as he was going to get from her for a while, and he took it. Orrin followed him everywhere by the 2nd day. The questions were relentless. What was this tool for? How did you fix that? Why did you cut the wood that direction? How many cows did Harlan own? Had Harlan ever seen a bear? What did bear tracks look like? Was Stockton fast? How fast? And Harlan answered them all, with the same brevity he used for everything, which somehow satisfied Orrin completely. The twins, a boy and a girl whose names he learned were Cal and Dory, were 4 and had not yet formed opinions about much except food and proximity to their mother. They began appearing near him when he worked, not interacting, just present, the way small children sometimes attach themselves to a new gravity without understanding why. The baby Perry was 18 months and had a spectacular scowl that he deployed at everything equally. He scowled at Harlan. He scowled at the chickens. He scowled at breakfast. He was working through a tooth, and nothing was acceptable to him. And Harlan, who had never spent time around a teething child, found it unexpectedly clarifying. On the 4th evening, Elowen sat down across from him at the table after the children were in bed, which had not happened before. She had the farm ledger in front of her, a worn book with columns in her handwriting, and she went through the numbers with him without being asked. The Callaway price is $4.20 per hundredweight, she said. Our field should produce about 800 to 850 weight. Call it 810 to be safe. That gives us $3,400. She looked up. 3,362 if you're at 810. I rounded up. I don't round up when I'm counting money I need. He almost smiled. Almost. Fair enough. After the 900 to you and operating costs for harvest hiring cutters, wagon fees, the Callaway commission, we're left with somewhere around 2,000 for the year. That's enough. It's exactly enough. Nothing more. She said it without self-pity, just as a fact. But it means we make it through winter. He looked at her ledger. The columns were impeccable. Every expense noted, every receipt dated, projected costs for every month of the coming year laid out in her careful handwriting. She had done this with a stub of pencil and the arithmetic in her head, and it was as accurate as any accounting he'd seen, from men who called it their profession. Did you keep books for the farm before? He asked. Someone had to. Your husband didn't. My husband was good at seeing what things could be, she said, and the way she said, it closed the subject gently but completely. Harlan nodded. He looked at the numbers again. Something was bothering him at the edge of his attention, something about the land description in the original note, but he couldn't put his finger on it yet. You'll make the harvest, he said. We'll make the harvest. She corrected him without heat. Yes, he said. You will. That night, lying in the barn with the repaired roof holding against a light rain, Harlan thought about what Rufus Dane had said to him 3 weeks ago at the Stockmen's Association meeting in Dunmore. He hadn't thought about it at the time because it had seemed like gossip, the kind of thing Rufus specialized in, a little information shaped around a lot of motive. Rufus had said, casual as anything, that the Wren property was going to come available soon, and that he was interested in the eastern pasture specifically, and had Harlan given any thought to selling that parcel once he'd taken the farm for the debt, the eastern pasture. Harlan had said he didn't know what he'd do with the property yet and moved on, because he hadn't been interested in what Rufus wanted and still wasn't. But the specificity of it was nagging at him now. Not the whole farm, the eastern pasture. That particular piece. Why? He lay there and worked it over and couldn't land on an answer, and eventually he stopped trying and let sleep take him. And in the morning he went back to work. The 5th day was when things from town started reaching them. Tessa came home from an errand to the dry goods store. She'd gone with a careful list and exact change, the way Elowen sent all the children, prepared for everything. And she came home with the supplies, and also with something in her face that wasn't the way she'd left. Elowen saw it immediately. What happened? Tessa set the supplies on the table and took a breath. Mrs. Fenwick said some things at the store. To Mrs. Altman. They didn't know I could hear. What kind of things? The girl looked at Harlan and then back at her mother. That you must have done something to make Mr. Voss stay. That a man like him doesn't just... She stopped. Elowen's face went absolutely still. That's enough. Mama, I heard you. That's enough, Tessa. Her voice was controlled, but the effort of keeping it controlled was visible. Put the sugar away, please. Tessa did as she was told. Harlan watched Elowen's hands on the table. She pressed them flat against the wood for 3 seconds, then took them away. People talk, Harlan said. I know they do. What they say about you staying on this farm isn't. I know what it isn't. She looked at him. I'm not concerned with what they say about me. I've been talked about since Silas died. I'll be talked about until something more interesting happens. She paused. I'm concerned with what they'll do. Talk usually isn't just talk. What do you think they'll do? She pressed her lips together. I don't know yet, but there's someone behind it. There usually is. She went back to the stove. She didn't say Rufus Dane's name, and neither did Harlan. But the name sat between them in the room like something heavy that neither of them wanted to be the first to pick up. The sixth day the harvest crew arrived. 4 men from the neighboring farms who'd agreed to help cut in exchange for 2 days of Elowen's own labor come their harvest season. That was how it worked out here. Barter and labor, and the understanding that everyone's survival was linked to everyone else's, whether they admitted it or not. Harlan worked with them. He didn't stand back and observe. He was in the field with a scythe from morning until his arms told him they'd had enough, and then he kept going an hour past that, because the field wasn't going to cut itself, and the weather wasn't going to wait for anyone's tired muscles. Elowen worked the binding end, gathering the cut wheat into sheaves and tying them with a deftness that came from years of doing it, faster than most of the men. She didn't rest in the middle of the day. She ate standing up like everyone else, and went back to work before her food was fully down. By the end of the 6th day, 2/3 of the field was cut and sheaved and drying. Harlan sat on the fence at the edge of the field at dusk and looked at what remained, and then looked at the woman 15 feet away who was talking to the cutting crew about tomorrow's work. And he had the unsettling and entirely unwelcome thought that he had never admired anyone quite so directly before. It was not a comfortable thought. He put it aside and went to the barn. On the 7th morning, the last morning of the agreement, Harlan went through his copy of the original loan documentation. He'd brought it with him in his saddlebag. He always brought originals to collections, because copies could be disputed, and he didn't deal in things that could be disputed. He spread it on the barn floor in the early light and went through it carefully, the way he went through everything he needed to understand properly. And he found it. He almost missed it because it was subtle, the kind of inconsistency that happened when a document was drawn up in a hurry or by someone who was being careless on purpose. The acreage description in the debt collateral section was correct, 160 acres, Wren homestead claim filed with the Territorial Surveyor's Office. But the boundary description of the collateral, the written description of what land, specifically was being pledged cut off the eastern pasture at the creek, which meant the eastern pasture, according to the document Silas had signed, was technically not included in the collateral. Harlan sat very still. He was a man who trusted documents. He built his life on documents. He had trusted this document for 14 months without reading it closely because he'd trusted the man who'd drawn it up, a Dunmore lawyer named Aldrich, who'd done work for Harlan twice before. Aldrich, who Harlan suddenly recalled, had done a land survey job for Rufus Dane 2 years ago. Harlan folded the document carefully and put it back in his saddlebag. Then he went to find Elowen. She was in the kitchen when he knocked on the doorframe. She turned from the stove with a question already forming on her face because she could read something in him. He could tell that. She was quick that way. "Can I see the county survey for your property?" he said. "The original filing." She looked at him for a moment. Then she went to the small wooden box on the shelf above the door and brought out a folded paper, worn along the crease lines. She handed it to him without asking why. He opened it on the table and looked at it. The county survey was clear and complete and included the eastern pasture in full, all the way to the spring marked in the bottom right corner. The spring. He stood very still for a long moment, looking at that small notation on the survey map. A hand-drawn circle. A single word, spring. "Mrs. Wren," he said carefully. "How long has that spring in the eastern pasture been running?" She came to stand beside him and look at the map. "As long as we've been here." Silas said it ran year-round, even through that dry summer 3 years ago when the Beckham Ranch lost 2 wells. Harlan looked at her. She looked back at him, and he could see the moment understanding began to move across her face, slow at first, then faster, the way a fire catches. "Someone wanted the eastern pasture," she said. "Yes." "Specifically, yes. And they made sure it wasn't included in the collateral description, so that even if you paid the debt, the eastern pasture could be claimed separately, or so that whoever took the farm on default could pursue it as a separate parcel," she finished. Her voice was very quiet. "Because a spring that runs through drought summers is worth more than the rest of the farm combined." The kitchen was very still. Outside, through the window, they could both see the last third of the wheat field, still standing, gold and full and ready. "Who drew up the loan document?" she asked. "A man named Aldrich in Dunmore." "Does he work for Rufus Dane?" "He has." She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said very evenly, "So the debt was real." "Yes. But the document was drawn to create a problem that wouldn't appear until after the property changed hands. That's what I think." Silas wouldn't have caught that. He wasn't. She stopped, pressed her lips together briefly. He wouldn't have read it that carefully. Most people don't. She turned away from the table and stood at the window. Her hands were at her sides and very still, and Harlan could see the muscles along her jaw working. "What does this mean?" she said, "for the 7 days?" "It means," Harlan said slowly, "that I need to think more carefully about what I'm doing here." She turned back around. Her eyes were steady and direct, and there was something in them that wasn't quite anger but was close to it. Not at him, he thought, but at the whole shape of what she was understanding. "I'm not asking for charity," she said. "I know. I'm not asking you to." "Elowen." He said her name and stopped himself, because he hadn't intended to use her first name and it had come out anyway, and the word sat in the kitchen between them with more weight than he'd put there on purpose. She didn't react to it, or if she did, she absorbed it without showing him. "The harvest finishes today," she said finally. "Yes, let me finish it, and then we'll talk about the rest." He nodded. She picked up the ledger from the table, tucked it under her arm, and went outside to the field. Harlan stood in the kitchen for a moment longer, looking at the county survey, with its small notation in the eastern corner. That little circle. That single word, spring. He thought about Rufus Dane's face at the stockmen's meeting. The particular casualness of a man who was being careless on purpose, who had mentioned the eastern pasture like it was an afterthought, knowing it wasn't. He thought about Silas Wren, signing a document he hadn't read carefully enough, scared and trying not to show it. He thought about 5 children in a doorway, quiet and watching. He folded the survey carefully, put it in his saddlebag beside the loan document, and went out to help finish the harvest. The last of the wheat came in at 4:30 in the afternoon. Harlan was on the far end of the field when it happened. He heard the cutters call out, the way men do when a job is finished. Not a cheer exactly, but a sound that meant something real was done. He straightened up from the row he'd been binding and looked across the field at what remained, which was nothing but stubble now, pale, and even in the late afternoon light, and the smell of cut grain hung in the warm air so thick you could almost taste it. Elowen was standing at the edge of the cleared field with her back to him. She didn't move for a moment, just stood there, and Harlan couldn't see her face, but he could see the way her shoulders were set, not relaxed, not celebrating, just absorbing it. The way a person takes in something they worked so hard toward that the actual arrival of it feels almost unreal. He walked toward her. The stubble crackled under his boots. When he got close enough, she turned and he could see her eyes were dry but the rims were red, and she had a piece of grain straw between her fingers that she was bending back and forth, without knowing she was doing it. "That's it," she said. "That's it." She looked at the field. Silas planted this. In the fall before he got sick. He never saw it come in. Harlan didn't say anything, because there wasn't anything to say to that. An empty comfort would have been worse than silence, and she would have known the difference. "I need to get the wagons to Callaway by Thursday," she said after a moment, her voice back to its usual businesslike register. "Before the price changes. I'll ride with you." She looked at him. "You don't have to do that." "I know." She studied him for a moment with that careful, reading look she had. Then she nodded once and went to talk to the cutting crew about loading the wagons in the morning. Harlan watched her go and stood in the stubble field alone for a minute, and the thought he'd had the evening before, the one about admiring her, came back and sat in him more heavily than it had before, and he still didn't know what to do with it. So he didn't do anything, which was his customary approach to things he couldn't immediately solve. The cutting crew left before supper. Elowen fed everyone. The children ate first, as they always did, and then the adults, and the meal was simple, but there was enough of it. Salt pork, boiled potatoes, the last of the early garden beans. Nothing wasted, nothing fancy. She moved around the table refilling cups and settling disputes between the twins, with the efficiency of someone who had been doing it so long it no longer took actual attention. After supper, after the children were in bed, Elowen sat down across from Harlan again and opened the ledger. "I need to tell you something," he said, before she could start. She looked up. He put the loan document on the table, open to the boundary description. He'd marked the relevant passage with a straight line in pencil, his own pencil, not hers. Then he put the county survey beside it. She looked at both documents. She didn't need it explained again. He'd said it this morning, and she was not a woman who needed things repeated. She was looking at them together, comparing, confirming what her mind had already understood. "So the note is technically unenforceable against the eastern pasture," she said. If it were contested, probably yes. But I'd have to contest it. Through a territorial court, yes, she sat back. Which costs money and time I don't have. Which is likely why the document was drawn this way, Harlan said. So the problem wouldn't surface until it was too late for you to do anything about it. She looked at the survey map for a long moment. The spring feeds 3 downstream properties during dry season. I knew that. Silas knew it. We never made anything of it because she paused. Because Silas wasn't that kind of man. What kind? The kind who looks at what he has and thinks about how to leverage it. She said it without judgment, or maybe with a kind of grief folded inside a neutral tone. He just wanted to farm. He just wanted the thing to work. Harlan nodded. How much is it worth, she asked. The water rights. He'd been thinking about this all afternoon. Depends on the season. Depends on what agreements you make. But 3 ranches with insufficient summer water, all of them needing that spring to function, you're looking at something significant, more than the farm's surface value. Elowen was quiet. And Rufus knew this, she said. Rufus knew this. And Rufus knew Silas had borrowed from you. He likely orchestrated the terms of it. She picked up the straw piece she'd been carrying from the field. She'd set it on the table without noticing. And now she put it down again deliberately. He manipulated Silas into debt, then made sure the debt document was written to separate the most valuable piece of land from the collateral, so that whoever ended up with the farm could pursue the eastern pasture separately. Or Rufus could acquire it cheaply during the chaos of a foreclosure sale before anyone realized what was underneath it, and you would have sold it. It wasn't an accusation. She said it plainly, as a fact about how things would likely have gone. Probably, Harlan said. I don't need more land. I'd have sold the whole parcel. The eastern pasture would have gone with it or separate, and if Rufus had made a quiet offer at the right moment, he stopped. I wouldn't have known to look for the problem, because I didn't look at the document closely enough. She looked at him. You're telling me you made a mistake. I'm telling you I didn't read something carefully enough. Yes. She seemed to consider this, not the mistake itself, but the fact that he'd said so directly without softening it. Most men don't admit that. It doesn't go away by not admitting it. Something moved across her face, not a smile, but something adjacent to it, something she pressed back down. So she said, What now? That's what I want to talk to you about. She folded her hands on the table. I'm listening. Harlan laid it out plainly. He did not believe in complicated presentations. The note was legally clouded because of the boundary error. She could contest it in territorial court, which would take months and money she didn't have. Or they could reach a private agreement between themselves that set aside the document's errors and started from a clean understanding of what was actually owed. She owed him $900. That was real. She'd agreed to it. Silas had signed for it, and Harlan had lent the money in good faith. The eastern pasture and its water rights were hers, fully, not part of the collateral, whatever Rufus had intended. He proposed this. She would pay the $900 from the wheat harvest, as agreed. The water rights remained with her land, uncontested. He would record a correct document with the county office, in both their names, confirming the original survey boundary. Elowen listened to all of this without interrupting. When he finished, she said, And in exchange? Nothing. She looked at him steadily. Men like you don't do things for nothing. I did business with a lawyer who apparently did business for Rufus Dane. That's my problem to fix. It's also your problem that letting the original note stand gives you a claim you could probably win in court. I could, but you're not going to. No, why? He looked at her across the table. The lamp between them was burning low, and neither of them had turned it up. Because it's wrong, he said simply. And I didn't know that when I rode out here, but I know it now. The kitchen was very quiet. Elowen Wren looked at him for a long time, really looked at him, the way she sometimes did, like she was reading the actual grain of something rather than just the surface. And whatever she found there seemed to satisfy a question she hadn't asked out loud. All right, she said. All right, but the harvest money goes to you first. Every dollar of what's owed. I'm not taking charity on the debt because the document was faulty. The money was borrowed and it gets paid. I wouldn't have it any other way, he said. She nodded, picked up the pencil, started writing the terms down in her ledger, in her careful, column, straight handwriting, like any other entry income, expense, agreement reached. He watched her write and thought that he had never met anyone quite like her, and that the thought was not going away the way he kept expecting it to. The drive to Dunmore took most of the following day. 2 wagons, loaded with the sheaved wheat, Harlan on horseback alongside, Elowen driving the lead wagon with Tessa beside her, and the younger children in the wagon bed behind. The twins had managed approximately 11 minutes of sitting quietly before relocating to various positions that made Elowen tell them to sit down 3 separate times, each time with decreasing patience. Orrin rode behind Harlan on Stockton for part of the way Harlan had offered without thinking about it, and Orrin had accepted with a seriousness that suggested he understood. It was not a small thing asking questions the entire time about cattle and trail drives, and what a stampede actually looked like. And Harlan answered all of them because a boy who asked that many questions and actually listened to the answers was worth the effort. They reached Callaway's grain operation by early afternoon. The Callaway buyer, a compact, efficient man named Prescott, came out to look at the load with the particular expression of a man who was trying to find something wrong with what he was seeing. He poked at the sheaves, checked the grain heads, asked about moisture and cutting date, all the things a buyer was supposed to ask. Elowen answered every question precisely and without elaboration. She had the numbers ready-weight estimates, cutting dates, field conditions. When Prescott tried to bring the price down half a cent per hundredweight, citing dryness in the heads, Elowen said, "The heads are within normal range for a late June cut in this county, and you know it, Mr. Prescott." The agreed price was $4.20. Prescott looked at her and then looked at Harlan, the way men sometimes looked at the man nearby when a woman said something inconvenient. Harlan looked back at him and said nothing. Prescott looked at Elowen again. $4.20, he said. "Thank you," she said, and meant it precisely as little as the situation required. The unloading took 2 hours. Harlan helped with the wagons. Elowen watched the weights being recorded with the same attention she gave her ledger, checking each number as it went down. When Prescott's clerk made an arithmetic error in the 3rd column, she caught it before the clerk did. "That should be 348, not 338, she said, pointing. The clerk checked it, fixed it, didn't apologize. Elowen watched the correction made and went back to checking numbers. Harlan, standing nearby, felt something he recognized after a moment as pride, which was a strange thing to feel about a woman he'd arrived to foreclose on 8 days ago, and he set it aside and helped move the last wagon. The payment came in the form of a bank draft from Callaway's operation, made out to Elowen Wren. She folded it carefully and put it inside her coat, next to whatever else she kept there. Then she walked to the counter of Callaway's back office and asked for an envelope and a pen. She wrote the amount on a slip of paper, $900 even. The original debt endorsed the portion of the bank draft, sealed it in the envelope, and handed it to Harlan in the middle of Callaway's back office, with witnesses present, which he thought was entirely intentional. "Paid in full," she said. As agreed, he took the envelope. As agreed. That was the transaction. Clear, witness, done. He should have felt finished. He felt the opposite of finished, which was a problem he carried with him out to the wagons and didn't put down. They were loading up to start the return drive when Rufus Dane found them. He came from across the main street of Dunmore with 2 men behind him. Not men who worked for him, exactly, but the kind of men who showed up near men like Rufus, when Rufus wanted to make a point through proximity. He was smiling, the same smile he'd had when he'd walked into the Wren kitchen, and he was looking at Harlan, not at Elowen, which was already wrong. "Harlan," he said, cheerful almost, "didn't expect to find you all the way out here." Rufus. "Business going well?" He looked at the wagons. At Elowen, still on the seat of the first wagon, her face showing nothing. "Looks like the widow managed her harvest after all. Surprising." He said surprising like it meant something else. "She did," Harlan said. "Generous of you to help." Rufus tilted his head. "People are talking about that, you know. How you've been out at the Wren place for over a week." He paused. "Some people find it unusual. A man of your position spending that kind of time on a widow's farm for a $900 note." He let that sit. Elowen came down off the wagon. Harlan almost said something. He didn't, because she was already moving, and he'd seen enough of her by now to know that getting in front of her when she was moving toward something was not useful. She walked up to Rufus Dane and stopped 2 feet from him. She was shorter than he was, and about half his width, and she looked at him like he was an arithmetic problem that she'd already solved. "I know what you did to my husband," she said. Rufus's smile flickered. "I don't know what the loan document, the boundary description, the eastern pasture." She watched his face. "I know exactly what you were trying to do. And I know you've been doing it for longer than I realized." The two men behind Rufus shifted slightly. Rufus's smile came back, steadier this time, because he'd had practice. "Mrs. Wren, I think you've had a difficult year, and you're looking for someone to blame. I have a county survey and a loan document," she said. "I have a lawyer's name and a record of work he did for you. And I have a man who will testify to what he's found in those papers." She didn't look at Harlan when she said it, but it was clear enough. "You can keep smiling if you want. It doesn't change the documents." Rufus looked past her at Harlan. "You're going to let her talk to me like this?" "She doesn't need my permission to talk to you," Harlan said. "Or my help, from what I can see." Something crossed Rufus's face. Not quite anger, but the beginning of it, the thing underneath anger that was actually fear being covered badly. He looked at Elowen again. "You think you've figured something out," he said, quieter now. "But you haven't figured out what you're dealing with." "I've figured out you," she said. "That's enough for today." She turned and walked back to the wagon. Rufus stood there. The two men behind him looked at each other. One of them started to say something, and Rufus held up a hand and didn't look at them, his eyes still on Elowen's back. Harlan stepped up beside him, not threateningly, just close enough that Rufus had to look at him. "The Eastern pasture documents are being corrected with the county office," Harlan said quietly. "This week. My lawyer is handling it. He hadn't arranged this yet, but he was going to, and saying it aloud now cost him nothing and closed a door he wanted closed. Whatever you were planning, that window is finished." Rufus looked at him for a moment. "You're making a mistake," he said, "getting tangled up with that family." "I've made mistakes before," Harlan said. "I know what they feel like. This isn't one." He walked back to his horse. They were 3 miles out of Dunmore before anyone spoke. The children had fallen asleep in the wagon bed, one by one, even Tessa, who tried to stay awake by a sheer act of will and lost. Harlan rode alongside the lead wagon in the late afternoon warmth, and Elowen drove without looking at him for a while. Then she said, "You hadn't arranged the lawyer yet." "No, but you said it anyway." "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. "That was well done." He almost said something modest and didn't, because she wasn't giving him a compliment exactly. She was acknowledging a tactical decision, and she'd make the same kind of acknowledgement for anyone who'd done it. "What you said to him," Harlan said. "Was that everything you know? Or do you have more?" She glanced at him. "I have more. Tell me," she told him. She'd sent a letter 3 weeks ago, before he'd ever ridden up to the farm, before the 7 days, before any of it, to a man named Deller in the Territorial Land Office. She'd had a feeling about the Eastern pasture that she couldn't prove but couldn't shake, ever since Silas had mentioned once, almost in passing, that a man had come asking about buying just that piece, just the eastern section, and hadn't seemed interested in anything else. Silas had told her it was probably nothing. Silas had been wrong about several things. Deller had written back. The letter had arrived on the 5th day, while Harlan was fixing posts, and she hadn't mentioned it, because she wasn't sure yet what it meant. But Deller had confirmed that 2 other properties in the same county had loan documents with similar boundary irregularities, both in the vicinity of shared water sources, both drawn up by the same Dunmore lawyer. Harlan listened to all of this. "You did this on your own. There was no one else to do it. You sent that letter before you even knew about the document problem." "I had a feeling," she said simply. He looked at her on the wagon seat, this woman in her faded dress with her careful ledger, and her letters to land offices, and her stubborn arithmetic, and he had the thought again, louder this time, that he had never met anyone like her. "Elowen," he said. She looked at him, and this time she didn't control the fact that she'd noticed he used her name again. "I'd like to help you with the rest of this," he said. Not as he stopped, tried to find the right word. Not as the man who held your note, as something else. What something else? It was a fair question, and he didn't have a clean answer for it. "I don't know yet," he said honestly. She looked at the road ahead. The horses moved at an even pace. Behind them, the sleeping children shifted in the wagon bed with the soft movements of deeply tired people. "All right," she said finally. "We'll figure out what something else means." That was how it started. Not dramatically, not with declaration, but with those 4 words on a dirt road in the late afternoon with a sleeping baby and 2 tired horses and the smell of cut grain still on both their hands. The days that followed were different from the 7. The 7 days had had a defined edge of business reason, a term and end point. What came after didn't have that. Harlan rode back to his property and dealt with his own operation and his own backlog, which was considerable after a week and a half away. And Garrett, his foreman, gave him a look when he rode in that said a great deal without requiring words. Problems? Garrett asked. Resolved. Garrett waited a beat. All of them? Harlan unsaddled Stockton. Working on it. He sent his lawyer, a man named Caldwell from Laramie, who was precise and careful and not involved in Rufus Dane's orbit, to the county office that same week with a corrected boundary description and the documentation to support it. Caldwell wrote him back 4 days later, confirming the correction was filed and that he'd noted the Dunmore attorney's name for the Territorial Bar Association, which might or might not result in anything but at least put it somewhere official. He rode back to the Wren farm on a Tuesday, 9 days after the Dunmore trip, and Elowen met him at the paddock with a face that suggested she'd been expecting him and was not going to say so. The correction filed, she said, last week. She nodded. I know. Deller's office sent confirmation. Of course they did. She turned toward the house. Coffee's on. He tied Stockton and followed her in. The children were at various occupations around the property. Tessa in the garden, Orrin at the woodpile doing something optimistic with a too large axe, the twins chasing chickens with a purposefulness that suggested they had a plan, and Perry sitting in the dirt outside the door building and destroying the same small pile of sticks with complete absorption. Harlan stopped and watched Perry for a moment. The baby looked up at him, deployed the spectacular scowl. Still working on that tooth? Harlan asked. Perry threw a stick. Harlan picked it up and handed it back to him. Perry considered this, then threw it again with more purpose. He does that for about 20 minutes, Elowen said from inside. Then he gets bored and moves on to something else. Harlan sat down on the step and handed the stick back a third time, and Perry, surprised by the consistency, held onto it for a moment instead of throwing it, and looked at Harlan with his mother's particular assessing expression on his small face. Inside, Elowen poured coffee and didn't ask him why he'd come back. That was the thing about her. She didn't ask questions that both people already knew the answers to. It was one of about 15 things he'd noticed about her in the past few weeks, and he was trying to stop noticing them, with no success. She sat down across from him with the ledger. Of course she had the ledger. I want to show you something, she said. She turned it to a page near the back, not the accounts, but something written out in her careful hand. A proposal, he realized as he looked at it. A cooperative water agreement. Handwritten terms for neighboring properties to access the spring during dry seasons, in exchange for labor and materials toward maintenance of channels, fencing, and storage. 3 tiers of access, priced fairly, structured, so that the smallest homestead could participate without being priced out. She'd written this while he was away. On her own at this table, in the evenings after the children were down. He read through it twice. This is well thought out, he said. I had time, she paused. I want your opinion on the pricing. You know what water is worth to a cattle operation better than I do. He looked at the numbers. She was slightly underpricing the summer peak access, which was the most valuable, and slightly overpricing the early spring, when ranches could usually manage on their own. He told her so, directly. She made corrections while he talked. Didn't argue. Didn't accept everything either. When he suggested a higher peak price, she shook her head. I don't want people to resent it, she said. If it's a fair deal, they'll honor it. If it feels like gouging, they'll find another way, or find a lawyer. And I've had enough of lawyers for a while. Fair point. Also, she said, if this works the way I think it can, I want other families to be able to expand it. Copy the model for their own properties. It shouldn't be the kind of thing only one person can do. He looked at her. You're building something you're willing to hand to other people. I'm building something that works, she said. Whether other people use it is up to them. He looked back at the ledger and thought about all the ranchers he knew who'd built something and then spent 20 years making sure nobody else could use it. He didn't say that out loud. You're going to need backing, he said, for the initial infrastructure. Channels, storage pond, at minimum. I know, I'd like to provide it. She looked up from the ledger. As a loan, as a partnership, the word sat between them. She turned it over visibly, the way she turned over anything with implications carefully, looking at all the sides. What does partnership mean, she said. In practice, you keep management of the cooperative. I provide equipment and cattle teams for the infrastructure work. Costs are recorded openly, he paused, and I have no claim on the water rights themselves. That stays yours. Why would you do that? Because it's a good idea and it'll work, and backing things that work is how I got 3,000 head of cattle from 40. She studied him. That's not the only reason. No, he said. It isn't. She looked at him for a moment longer, and then she looked back at her ledger, and he could see something in the set of her shoulders that was different from the first day. Not softer exactly, but less braced, the way a person stands when they've stopped waiting for something bad. I'll think about it, she said, which from Elowen Wren, he was beginning to understand was nearly the same as yes. Tessa appeared in the doorway with a handful of something from the garden early beans, still on the vine, and stopped when she saw Harlan, and did not leave, which he recognized by now as progress. She dropped the beans on the counter without being asked and went back outside. And, through the window, Harlan could see her pause in the yard and say something to Orrin, who looked at the house and nodded seriously. She doesn't trust Easy, Elowen said, not looking up. She watches everything, Harlan said. She's been watching the farm since April. Someone had to. A beat. I should have let her be 8 more than I did. He didn't offer comfort on that because she wasn't asking for it. She said it the way people said hard things that were true and couldn't be fixed. Just acknowledged. She'll be all right, he said instead, which wasn't comfort, it was an assessment. And Elowen received it as one. Yes, she said, she will. Outside, Perry had moved on from the sticks to something Harlan couldn't see from this angle, but the quality of silence from that direction was the particular silence of a child being very busy. Orrin appeared in the doorway with a piece of fence wire in his hand and an expression of pure problem-solving crisis. Mama, Cal got his boot stuck in where? The fence post by the chicken run. His lace went through the wire, and Elowen was already up. She took the fence wire from Orrin. Why he'd brought it was unclear, and went through the door. And Harlan heard her voice outside, calm and practical, and a 4-year-old's distress gradually converting to irritation and then to silence. Harlan sat at the table with the ledger open in front of him. In the kitchen of the Wren farm, with afternoon light falling through the oilskin window and coffee he hadn't finished cooling in the cup, and he thought that this ordinary, imperfect, noisy, careful, alive thing happening around him was something he had not understood he was missing until he sat inside it. He was quiet about that thought. He was a man who was quiet about most things. But he did not put this one aside the way he'd been putting the others. He left it where it was and let it stay. The partnership agreement took 3 weeks to put on paper, and it was harder than either of them expected. Not because they disagreed on the substance. On the substance they were surprisingly aligned, which Harlan found almost unsettling, because he had spent 17 years disagreeing with most people on most things, and had come to consider it a natural condition. The difficulty was in the language. Elowen wanted precision. Harlan wanted brevity. What they got was a document that went through 6 drafts, each one with her pencil corrections in the margins and his crossed-out sections, and the negotiation over the word oversight alone took the better part of an afternoon. Oversight implies I need supervising, she said. It's a standard term. It's a term that means something specific, and I don't like what it means. Then what would you prefer? She thought about it. Consultation rights. That's 2 words instead of 1. Words that mean the right thing. She looked at him steadily. You can consult. You cannot oversee. The different relationships. He looked at the document. He crossed out oversight and wrote consultation in his own hand and pushed the draft back to her without comment because she was right and arguing about it further would have been vanity. They signed the final version on a Thursday morning at the kitchen table, with Caldwell present, as witness Harlan had brought him up from Laramie, partly for legitimacy, and partly because he trusted Caldwell to tell him if something in the agreement was lopsided, and he actually wanted to know. Caldwell read through it twice, made no objections, and signed where indicated. Unusual structure, Caldwell said afterward, accepting the coffee Elowen put in front of him without being asked. How so? She asked. Management sits entirely with you. Financial exposure sits primarily with Mr. Voss. Most arrangements I see, those are reversed. That's because most arrangements are made by people who have the money, Elowen said, not by the people who have the idea. Caldwell looked at Harlan. Harlan said nothing and drank his coffee. Caldwell left by mid-morning. The signed document went into the wooden box, above the door Elowen's filing system, which was more organized than it looked alongside the county survey, and the corrected boundary description, and the letter from Deller's office. The first practical thing the partnership produced was a mess. Harlan brought 2 of his cattle teams and 3 workers out the following week to start digging the initial channel from the spring toward the shared boundary of the nearest property to the east a modest homestead belonging to a family named Beckwith, who'd had 2 dry summers in a row and were very interested in what Elowen was proposing. The digging was slow because the ground had a shelf of caliche 18 inches down that nobody had surveyed for, and the picks made a sound on it like striking a bell, flat and wrong, and you could feel it in your palms an hour after you stopped working. Harlan's man, Garrett, who'd come along to manage the cattle teams, looked at the caliche shelf the first afternoon and said, with the equanimity of a man who had seen many things go wrong, "We're going to need to reroute." "How far?" Harlan asked. "North 12 feet, maybe 15. That crosses the fence line." "Yes, it does." Elowen was there. She had been there every day, checking the grade of the channel against the notes she'd made from a water management pamphlet she'd sent away from the Territorial Agricultural Office. A pamphlet she had read so thoroughly the binding had separated. She looked at the caliche shelf, and then at the fence line, and then at her notes. "The Beckwith's fence line," she said, "not mine." "Yes, ma'am. I need to talk to Vera Beckwith. She rode over that afternoon." Harlan went with her because he had a horse, and she had a wagon that was slower, and there wasn't a reason not to, and he had stopped manufacturing reasons not to go places with her, which was its own kind of admission that he hadn't made formally yet. Vera Beckwith was 60, broad-shouldered, and had an opinion about everything that she delivered without advance notice. She met them in her yard and looked at Harlan with the frank assessment of a woman who had no time for pretense. "You're the one holding her note," she said. "Was," Harlan said. "It's settled. Heard you stayed out there a week helping with harvest." "I did." Vera looked at Elowen. "And now he's here helping with this." "He is," Elowen said. "And I'd like to talk to you about your east fence line, Vera, because we have a problem with the channel route." Vera shifted her attention to the actual issue with the focus of someone who lived close enough to practical problems to prefer them over social ones. Elowen explained the caliche shelf, the required reroute, the 15 feet of fence that would need to temporarily come down. "What's temporarily?" Vera asked. 2 weeks at most. "The channel goes in, we reset the posts, the fence goes back up. My east pasture's got cattle in it." "I know. We moved them to your north section for the 2 weeks. I'll send Orrin over to help your boy manage the shift." "Orrin's 8. He's also better with cattle than most men I know," Elowen said, and said it so directly that Vera laughed a short, surprised sound. "All right," Vera said, 2 weeks. "But if one of my Herefords ends up missing?" "Then we find it," Elowen said, "together. That's what the agreement is for." Vera looked at Harlan again. "You're quiet. This is her negotiation," he said. Vera raised her eyebrows and looked back at Elowen with something that might have been approval. "When do you want to start?" The fence came down on a Monday. The caliche reroute added 4 days to the dig, not 2 weeks, which was a small victory they'd take. The channel reached the Beckwith boundary by the 3rd week of August, which was the beginning of the worst dry stretch in 3 years, and that timing, Harlan thought, was either luck or the territory finally paying someone back for what it owed. The first time water ran through the completed channel to Vera Beckwith's property, Vera stood at the outlet and watched it for a while and didn't say anything. Her son Ellis, who was 19 and had his mother's directness without yet having her restraint, said, "Well, hell," which covered it adequately. Word traveled the way word always traveled in that part of Wyoming, faster than news, slower than rumor, and never quite accurately. Within a week, Elowen had 2 more inquiries from neighboring properties, a family named Soto, whose well had been declining for 2 summers, and an older rancher named Pruitt, who ran about 200 cattle on the property east of the Beckwiths, and had lost 17 head to dehydration the previous July. Pruitt came to the farm on a Wednesday uninvited. He was a large man, 60-something, with a white beard and hands like shovels, and he stood in the yard and looked at Elowen the way men of his generation sometimes looked at women who were doing something they found surprising. Not quite respectful, not quite dismissive, hovering somewhere in the middle. "I hear you're running a water operation," he said. "A cooperative," Elowen said. "There's a difference." "What's the difference?" "A water operation means I sell you something. A cooperative means we both put something in and both get something back." Pruitt chewed on that. "And what do I put in?" "Labor and materials for your portion of the channel. 4 days of your hired men, and whatever timber you can bring from your upper stand for the storage pond framing." "And what do I get back?" "Access to the spring during months when your well drops below functional depth. Documented, contracted, enforceable." He looked at her for a moment. "You drew that up yourself?" I did. You got a lawyer looking at it? Caldwell, out of Laramie. He reviewed and witnessed the founding agreement. Pruitt looked past her at Harlan, who was fixing the paddock latch, or appearing to. Anyway. Voss, he called out. You in on this? Infrastructure backing, Harlan said without looking up from the latch. Not management, not management. Pruitt looked at Elowen again. Something in his assessment shifted, not dramatically, but perceptibly, the way a heavy thing moves when the ground settles under it. All right, he said slowly. Show me the agreement. She showed him the agreement. He read it slower than Caldwell had, and asked more questions, some of which were good, and some of which repeated themselves, and she answered all of them, with the same patience she used on the children, which was not infinite patience but was very well-managed patience. He signed at the kitchen table in the same spot Caldwell had, and Elowen gave him a copy and filed the original in the wooden box. 3 properties, she said to Harlan that evening, after Pruitt had gone. She had the ledger open, the new entries made in fresh ink. 4, counting yours. I don't count mine. Mine is where the spring is. It's still a participant. She tapped the pencil against the page. We need the storage pond before winter. If it's not built before the ground freezes, we lose the timeline. I know. Garrett has the lumber order in. I want to see the lumber specification. I'll send it over. Today? He looked at her. Today. She nodded. She made a note. She closed the ledger and stood up and started clearing the supper dishes. They'd eaten together again, as they had fallen into the habit of doing on the days, most days now, and they had not formally discussed that either. Tessa was washing dishes. She'd started doing it without being asked, which was both helpful and a small sign that she was still carrying more than a child her age should need to carry. She scrubbed each dish with more force than necessary, the way people clean things when they're working something out that has nothing to do with the dish. Tessa, Harlan said. She looked at him over her shoulder, guarded, as always. You want to ride out tomorrow and see how the channel work is going? She looked at her mother, automatic permission, or more accurately, a temperature check. Elowen was watching her. You can go, Elowen said, if you want. Tessa looked back at the dish, scrubbed it another few seconds. Maybe, she said, which from Tessa meant yes. In the morning, she was waiting at the paddock before Harlan got there. He didn't say anything about that. He saddled Stockton, and she rode behind him on one of the Wren farm's 2 horses, an aging bay mare named Prudence, who had opinions about pace and acted on them, and they rode out to the channel site without much conversation. At the site, Tessa got down and walked along the completed portion of the channel with the careful scientific attention of a girl who noticed things. She crouched at the joint where the Beckwith section connected and looked at the way the water moved. It's running slower here, she said. Garrett nearby looked over. Grade drops a little at the connection point. We leveled as best we could. If you built the channel 3 inches higher on the south side here, she stood up and paced the section off. It would run faster through this stretch and slow down before it hits the outlet. Less erosion. Garrett looked at her, then at Harlan. Harlan looked at Tessa. Where'd you learn about grade and erosion? Mama's pamphlet, she said. The one from the agricultural office. I read it. Harlan looked at Garrett. Garrett looked at the channel section. She's not wrong, he said. Then fix the grade, Harlan said. Tessa walked back toward the horses, and Harlan followed, and she didn't say anything about the exchange, and neither did he. But he noticed that she walked a little differently on the way back, shoulders less tight, like something that had been held in position could finally ease. That was a Tuesday. By Thursday, the thing with Rufus Dane escalated into something none of them had seen coming. It came in the form of a letter. Elowen found it slipped under the farm's front door in the morning, which meant someone had come in the night, or before first light. Neither option was comfortable. The letter was unsigned. It was printed, not handwritten, in block capitals on plain paper, which was either an attempt at anonymity or an attempt to look official, and it wasn't clear which. It said, "The spring on your eastern pasture was surveyed under a provisional claim that did not meet territorial requirements. The water rights are subject to challenge. Anyone drawing agreements on those rights is operating on contested ground." Elowen read it twice. Then she handed it to Harlan without expression. He read it. The thing that struck him first was the legal-sounding language provisional claim, territorial requirements, contested ground, which was the language of someone who'd talked to a lawyer, or was pretending to have. "Is there anything to this?" she asked. "I don't know yet. The phrasing is vague enough that it could mean something or nothing." He folded the letter. I need to send this to Caldwell. Do that. She was already moving toward the stove. And in the meantime, we keep building. Elowen, if there's a real legal challenge, then we deal with it when it has a name on it. She turned to look at him. Anonymous letters are not legal challenges. They're warnings. Someone wants us to stop. And if we don't stop and then the challenge materializes, we're 3 weeks from having the storage pond framed. She said it like a fact that had already decided the conversation. If we stop now and the challenge is nothing, we've lost 3 weeks. If we stop now and the challenge is real, we've also lost 3 weeks, and we're in no better position legally. She put the coffee pot on the heat. So we keep building. He thought about arguing with her. He thought about it for about 2 seconds, and then recognized it as a waste of both their time. He rode to the telegraph office in Dunmore that afternoon and sent Caldwell a detailed message. Caldwell's reply came back the next morning. Provisional claim language refers to pre-1876 water filings. Your survey postdates that. Challenge unlikely to succeed but possible to delay. Filing a counter-declaration this week. Do not stop construction. Harlan rode back to the farm with Caldwell's reply written out and handed it to Elowen without comment. She read it. Thank you, she said. Went back to the storage pond site, where Pruitt's men were cutting timber for the framing, and started explaining to them where she wanted the first corner post. But the letter wasn't the end of it. On Friday, Rufus Dane rode into the cooperative's construction site. Not the farm, the construction site, which was on shared boundary ground between 3 properties, which meant he wasn't technically trespassing anywhere specific, and he knew it. He came with the same 2 men from Dunmore and 1 additional person, a thin man in a clean coat who carried a leather document case and had the expression of someone who was paid to look serious. The thin man's name, he announced, was Greer. He was, he said, representing a claim on behalf of several interested parties regarding the water rights of the Eastern Pasture Spring. Garrett looked at Harlan. The workers looked at each other. Pruitt's man Ellis, who was 20 feet away with a post hole digger, set it down and stood up. Elowen was at the far end of the site. Harlan saw her turn, saw her read the situation in about 4 seconds. Rufus, the men, the leather case, and start walking toward them. He moved to intercept her, not to stop her but to walk beside her, because that was what he could do. Greer, she said when she reached them. Who do you represent specifically? Greer opened his leather case. A consortium of names, she said. Legal names. Greer glanced at Rufus. Rufus gave a small nod that he thought was subtle and wasn't. Dane Livestock Associates, Greer said, and 2 affiliated parties. Affiliated how? Contractually. With Rufus Dane? With the associates, yes. Elowen looked at Rufus. You created a company. Rufus smiled. The one that didn't reach anything above his chin. Good morning, Mrs. Wren. You created a company specifically to file a water claim against my property. I created a company to protect legitimate interests that were minus. When was it registered? She asked Greer. Greer hesitated. Last month. Last month, she repeated. After the boundary correction was filed with the county office, she looked at Harlan. Something in her face was controlled very carefully. After the cooperative agreement was signed. The timing of the registration is not relevant to the validity. It's very relevant, she said. It establishes that the claim was created in response to legal actions I had already taken, which means it's reactive, not pre-existing, which is a different legal posture than an independent water claim. She looked at Greer. I assume you know that. Greer looked slightly uncomfortable, which Harlan noted. Mrs. Wren, Rufus said, his voice dropping to something that was trying to be reasonable. I've been patient about this, more patient than most men would be. But what you're building here affects downstream water access that my operation depends on, and I have a right to minus. Your operation, she said, is 2 miles from this spring and on the other side of a ridge. You don't draw from this watershed. You never have. She took 1 step toward him. Stop telling me what your rights are. What you have is a scheme that isn't working the way you planned, and you're trying to find a new angle. Rufus's smile faded. Not quickly. It faded the way things fade when they've been maintained a long time, and the effort finally costs too much. You should be careful, he said quietly. About what specifically? About thinking you've already won. I don't think I've won anything, she said. I think I'm building something, and I think you're going to have a very difficult time stopping it in territorial court when 3 has signed. Landowners and a Laramie attorney show up to explain the timeline. She looked at Greer. File whatever you're going to file. Our attorney's name is Caldwell. He'll receive it directly. She turned to Harlan. Can you ask Ellis to bring the post digger back over? We've got 4 more posts before we can frame the first section. She walked back toward the construction site. Ellis retrieved the post digger without being asked. Garrett picked up where his crew had stopped. Pruitt's men, who had watched the entire exchange from their work positions like theater patrons, went back to cutting timber. Rufus stood at the edge of the site for a moment. Harlan stayed where he was, between Rufus and the site, not doing anything except standing there. Rufus looked at him. You understand she's going to drag you into a legal fight that costs more than the spring is worth to you. It's not about what it's worth to me, Harlan said. Then what's it about? Harlan looked at him without particular expression. She's right and you're wrong. That's what it's about. Rufus held his gaze for a moment, then turned and walked back to his horse. Greer followed, still holding his leather case, the documents inside it never produced. The 2 other men went without looking at anyone. Harlan watched them ride out, and when they were far enough, he turned back to the site, where Ellis and Garrett and 4 other men were working, and where Elowen was demonstrating to Pruitt's youngest hired hand how to read a grade line with 2 stakes and a length of string. He stood and watched that for a moment. Then he walked over and picked up a shovel and went to work. Caldwell arrived in person 4 days later, which he wouldn't have done for just a legal filing. He arrived with 2 things, the counter-declaration he'd filed with the Territorial Land Office and a look on his face that meant he had additional information. He and Harlan and Elowen sat at the kitchen table. It was always the kitchen table, Harlan had noticed, the table being the place this family did everything that mattered, and Caldwell spread out his papers with the careful arrangement of a man presenting a case. The counter-declaration was solid. It rested the water rights claim on the post 1,876 survey, which was legally superior to anything Danes Associates could file under the provisional claim language, and it included a timeline of construction and agreements that established Elowen's position as primary claimant before any competing filing existed. But the second thing Caldwell had was more interesting. I did some looking into Aldrich, Caldwell said. The Dunmore attorney who drew your loan document. I assumed you would, Harlan said. He drew up 3 documents in the past 4 years with similar boundary irregularities. All 3 involved properties with water features, springs, consistent wells, creek access. All 3 were loans where the borrower was in financial difficulty, and the lender had some connection to Rufus Dane's business circle. Caldwell looked at Elowen. 2 of those properties changed hands. The water features were later sold separately, in both cases to parties who subsequently sold them to Dane's operation. The kitchen was quiet for a moment. He's been doing this for 4 years, Elowen said. At minimum. 3 families lost their water. 2 lost the properties entirely. 1 managed to hold the land but not the water rights. She sat with this for a moment. Harlan watched her face. She was processing it, not performing emotion, just working through what it meant in the way she worked through everything. Those families, she said. Do they know what happened to them? Probably not. When it happens in stages over months or years, people don't always see the pattern. Can they reclaim what they lost? Caldwell hesitated. It would be complex. Time has passed. Some of the subsequent sales have been legitimate enough that unwinding them would require. But it's possible. He looked at her steadily. With significant effort and documentation, possibly yes. She nodded slowly. All right, she looked at Harlan. We need to document everything Deller found. The other properties, the Aldrich connection, all of it. Not just for us, for them. Harlan studied her. That's a fight beyond protecting your own water rights. I know that. It involves other legal processes, other families, possibly a case against a practicing attorney in territorial court. I know what it involves. She didn't raise her voice. She was very calm. Are you saying we shouldn't do it? He thought about it honestly. I'm saying it's more than we've signed up for. Those families didn't sign up for what happened to them either. She folded her hands on the table, the way she did when she was certain about something. I had information other people didn't have. I had your backing when those other people didn't have anyone. If I just protect my own spring and walk away from the rest, she stopped. That's not something I'm willing to do. Caldwell was watching both of them. Harlan looked at the papers on the table. At Caldwell. At Elowen. Then we don't walk away from the rest, he said. She looked at him for a moment, that direct, reading look, and then she nodded once and turned to Caldwell. What do you need from us to start? Caldwell pulled out a fresh sheet of paper. Everything you have on Deller's findings. Every document, every letter, every date. Elowen stood up, went to the wooden box above the door, and started pulling documents. Outside the kitchen window, the storage pond site was visible in the afternoon light, the framing half done then, the corner posts set, the timber waiting in stacked lengths for the next workday. 3 families' access to water, built with labor and lumber, and a cooperative agreement drawn up in pencil at a kitchen table. And now, maybe, a chance to give back something that had been taken from 2 families who hadn't even known they were losing it. Harlan looked at all of it, the documents spreading across the table, Caldwell's careful handwriting beginning to move, Elowen's hand finding the right papers in the right order, unhesitating. And he thought that the woman had walked out to meet him in a faded dress 8 weeks ago and shown him a wheat field. And what had grown from that was not what either of them had expected. Not just the cooperative. Not just the legal fight taking shape in Caldwell's notes. Something else that neither of them had named yet, that sat between them in every room they were in together, patient and present, and waiting for the right moment that neither of them had yet decided to create. He picked up his coffee cup, which was cold again, because it was always cold by the time he got back to it, and drank it anyway. Some things you took as they came, not as you wished them. That was a lesson Elowen Wren had been teaching him since the day he rode up her drive, intending nothing more than arithmetic, and he was still learning it, and he suspected he would be for a long time. Caldwell filed the expanded case with the territorial court on a Wednesday, and by Friday every rancher and homesteader within 20 miles knew about it. That was the thing about legal filings in small territories. They didn't stay quiet. The clerk at the courthouse had a brother who ran the feed store in Dunmore, and the feed store was where people talked, and what people said at the feed store was distributed across the valley faster than any newspaper could manage. By the weekend, 3 versions of the story were circulating, 2 of them wrong in different directions, and Harlan spent an uncomfortable Saturday morning at the Stockmen's Association answering questions he hadn't invited. "I heard you're suing Rufus on behalf of the widow," said a rancher named Callum, who had the particular talent of making facts sound slightly indecent. "We're not suing Rufus," Harlan said. "We're filing a counter-declaration on the water rights and a separate complaint regarding the attorney who drew up fraudulent loan documents." "Aldrich?" "Yes," Callum chewed on that. "Aldrich drew up my grazing lease 2 years ago." Harlan looked at him. "Then you might want to read it carefully." That conversation was replicated in various forms throughout the morning, and by the time Harlan rode back to the Wren farm, in the afternoon he had a clearer picture of how far Aldrich's work had spread through the valley's property documents. And it was not a comfortable picture. At least 6 ranchers had used Aldrich for something significant in the past 5 years. Several of them, once the seed of doubt was planted, were going to go home and dig out papers they hadn't looked at closely since signing. Elowen was in the yard when he arrived, talking to a woman he didn't recognize, mid-40s, weathered, with the look of someone who had driven a significant distance that morning and had more to say than she'd managed yet. She introduced herself as Clara Holt. Her family had lost water rights to a spring on their eastern property 2 years ago. They'd thought it was a legitimate sale, pressured but legal. She'd heard about what Caldwell had filed, and she'd come directly. Harlan stood back. Elowen took Clara Holt inside and sat her down at the kitchen table and listened for 45 minutes without interrupting. And when Clara was finished, Elowen asked her 7 precise questions and wrote down the answers in the ledger. Not the accounts ledger, a new one she'd started for the case documentation. And then she told Clara what Caldwell would need and what the likely timeline was and what she could honestly promise and what she couldn't. "I can't promise you get the water back," Elowen said, when Clara looked at her with the particular hope of someone who has been hopeless for a while and is afraid to take it up again. "I can promise that what happened to you gets documented properly and presented to someone with the authority to do something about it. Whether they do it, that part isn't mine to control." Clara was quiet for a moment. "That's an honest answer. It's the only kind I have." Clara looked at Harlan, who was standing in the doorway, having not been invited to sit and not having sat. "Is she always like this?" "She is," he said. Clara Holt left with Caldwell's contact information and a copy of the case timeline. She was the second affected family to make contact. She would not be the last. The storage pond framing was completed in the 3rd week of August, 2 days behind schedule because of a rainstorm that came through on a Thursday and turned the site into a substance that was not quite mud and not quite anything else and didn't allow work. Elowen stood at the edge of the site in the rain, looking at the framing with her arms crossed, and an expression that suggested the rain had made a poor decision. Garrett nearby said, "We can make it up Friday and Saturday." "We'll need to," she said. "The Soto property needs access before the dry stretch hits." "Might not hit this year." "It hits every year. Sometimes in October, sometimes September. This summer's been dry enough that it'll be earlier." She turned and walked back toward the farm, her boots finding the least bad route through the mud, with the automatic precision of someone who had crossed bad ground many times. "Friday and Saturday." "Yes, ma'am," Garrett said. Harlan watched this from the shelter of the barn overhang. He'd noticed that Garrett, who was not a man who called most people anything at all, had started calling Elowen ma'am sometime in the third week, without fanfare, without being asked. It was the kind of thing that meant something without needing to be said. The legal situation developed with the speed of things that move through institutions, which is to say slower than anyone wanted and occasionally all at once. Aldrich, when Caldwell's formal complaint reached the Territorial Bar Association, did not contest it. He hired his own attorney, not from Dunmore, from Cheyenne, and what followed was a period of documentation exchange that Caldwell described as vigorous and Harlan translated as expensive. Harlan paid Caldwell's fees without discussing it with Elowen first, which turned out to be a mistake. She found out on a Tuesday when a billing statement arrived, addressed to Harlan at the farm. He'd been having correspondence sent there for convenience, which now seemed like a poor decision, and she came to find him at the paddock, with the statement in her hand and an expression that was very controlled. "You paid Caldwell's full retainer," she said. "He needed it to proceed. You should have told me. It happened quickly. That's not the reason you didn't tell me." She held up the statement. "You made a financial decision about this case without consulting me. The case that is about my property, my water rights. My name on the complaint." He looked at her. She was right. He'd done it the way he did things in his own operation, saw what was needed, arranged it, moved forward. That worked when it was his business. This was not entirely his business. "I should have told you," he said. "Yes. I'll tell you next time before I do it." She folded the statement. "The amount gets added to the partnership accounts. My half of the legal costs comes out of the cooperative income when it starts generating." "Elowen, you don't need to." "My name is on the complaint," she said again, not loudly. "My half." He nodded. She handed him the folded statement and went back to the house. And he stood at the paddock, holding it, and thought that being in partnership with someone who had genuine self-respect was more complicated than being in business with people who just wanted money, and also fundamentally better, and he was still getting used to the difference. Rufus Dane, meanwhile, was having a difficult autumn. The water claim filed by Dane Livestock Associates was rejected by the Territorial Land Office in September. Caldwell's counter-declaration had held. The timeline was clear, and the post-1876 survey left no procedural room for the provisional claim language Greer had tried to deploy. Greer submitted a formal withdrawal, and his name disappeared from the correspondence. Rufus did not withdraw. He shifted tactics. Instead of legal filings, he started working the social dimension of the valley, the Ranchers Association, the Dunmore merchants who extended credit, the informal network of influence that ran through every small community and was harder to counter than a court document because it had no fixed address. He wasn't threatening people, not directly. He was talking, expressing concern, noting that the cooperative was an untested idea managed by a woman without formal business training, backed by a rancher who seemed to have lost perspective on what was a personal matter and what was a business matter. He said this to enough people that it started coming back to Harlan in fragments. Third-hand reports, overheard comments at the feed store, a look from a man he'd done business with for a decade that lasted a beat too long. Harlan sat with this for 2 days. He was not a man who engaged with gossip, and his instinct was to ignore it. But he knew from experience that ignoring something long enough could let it become the only story, and the only story in a small valley could do real damage to real things. He talked to Elowen about it on a Wednesday evening, after supper, after the children were in bed. He told her directly what he'd heard and where, and he watched her face while he talked. She listened to all of it. "He's not wrong that you've lost perspective," she said when he finished. "Just wrong about what you've lost it on." That surprised him. "You think I've lost perspective?" "I think you rode out here to collect a debt." And you've been here nearly 3 months, and you've backed a legal fight that wasn't yours, and you've spent money that you'll likely recover, but didn't have to spend. She looked at him steadily. From the outside, a person could make the case. What case would you make? She was quiet for a moment. That you made decisions based on what was right, not what was easy. And that you backed a person who was being wronged because you understood the wrong and had the capacity to help. A pause. That's not lost perspective. That's judgment. Then you don't think it's a problem. I think Rufus saying it is a problem. She turned the coffee cup in her hands. He's trying to make you doubt yourself. Make you wonder if you're being made a fool of. Because if you pull back, if you decide the whole thing has cost you too much reputation, then I lose the backing, and the case loses support, and he has a chance to let it die quietly. Harlan looked at her. I know that. I know you know it. She set the cup down. I wanted to say it out loud so you know that I know it too. So you know that I'm not asking you to take that risk without understanding what it costs you. He studied her across the table. Has it ever occurred to you that some things are worth the cost? She met his eyes. Something moved in her face. Not a performance, just something that came up and was visible for a moment before she brought it back under management. Yes, she said quietly, it has. The moment stretched. A log in the stove shifted, and the fire crackled, and outside the wind came up briefly and then settled. Harlan didn't say what he wanted to say, because he didn't yet know how to say it in a way that was fair to her. That wasn't too much weight to put on a woman, still finding her footing after 2 terrible years. That wasn't asking her to receive something she hadn't invited. So he held it, the way he'd been holding it for weeks. We keep going, he said. Yes, she said, we keep going. October came, and with it the dry stretch Elowen had predicted, right on schedule. The Soto well dropped in the first week. The Beckwith South pasture water access declined to the point where Vera Beckwith would have been moving cattle anyway, agreement or not. Pruitt lost one section of creek flow that he'd been counting on. The cooperative spring ran. Not dramatically, water didn't know it was supposed to be dramatic. It just ran, steady and clear, through the channel system that had taken 6 weeks and 2 arguments about grade lines and 1 rainstorm and 1 encounter with Rufus Dane to build. It ran to the Beckwith outlet and the Soto connection and the first branch of the Pruitt channel, and the people who needed it came with their stock and their storage barrels and they used it, and nobody made speeches about it because they were too busy being relieved. Elowen kept records. Every access day, every volume estimate, every material contribution from each participating property. She kept it in the new ledger with the same precision she'd kept everything else, and on the 1st of November, she sat down and did the cooperative's first formal accounting. She called Harlan in to look at it. The income was modest. The cooperative wasn't designed to generate significant profit. It was designed to be self-sustaining. But it was self-sustaining. The access fees and labor contributions covered maintenance costs and left a small reserve. Not enough to call it success exactly, but enough to call it viable. It works, she said. Yes, she looked at the numbers. The Soto family asked last week if their cousin could join. They have a small claim 3 miles east with a similar water problem. What did you tell them? I told them to come talk to me when they were ready. She tapped the pencil on the page. I need to think about how to structure expansion. Adding members means adding infrastructure costs before the new access fees offset them. That's a timing problem, not a fundamental problem. I know. I'm working through the timing. She looked at him. I might want to talk to you about it. I know I'm available for that. The faintest trace of something, not quite a smile, but related to one crossed her face and disappeared. She closed the ledger. The case against Aldrich resolved in November through the Territorial Bar Association's disciplinary process. He was suspended from practice for 18 months and required to make remediation payments to affected parties. The amounts were negotiated, and they were not full compensation for what had been lost, but they were something. Clara Holt's family received an acknowledged claim that Caldwell said positioned them well for a subsequent civil action if they chose to pursue it. Aldrich left Dunmore. His office above the feed store closed, the sign came down, and by December the space had been rented to a saddle maker who had no opinion about water rights and went to bed early. Rufus's response to Aldrich's suspension was silence, which was more revealing than anything he might have said. He stopped attending the Stockmen's Association meetings in November. He stopped appearing in Dunmore with any regularity. His operation continued. He had enough of an operation that it continued on its own momentum, but the social infrastructure of influence he'd built over years had taken damage that couldn't be repaired simply by showing up again. Harlan heard this and did not feel satisfied. He had expected to feel satisfied and found instead something more complicated, a kind of weariness that came from a long fight finally running out of active opposition, which wasn't the same as victory. Things had been set right, mostly. Not entirely, not for everyone, not without cost. That was how things actually resolved in his experience. The clean endings happened in other kinds of stories. He was at the farm on the day the final papers arrived from Caldwell. That the water rights counter-declaration was fully recorded. Elowen's name as primary holder clearly established. The cooperative's founding documents, registered with the Territorial Land Office. Caldwell sent a letter along with it, which was not his usual style, and it said simply, "Well done to you both." Elowen read the confirmation letter at the table. She read it twice, which was her habit with important documents, and then she set it down and looked at the window for a moment. "That's it?" Orrin asked. He was at the table too, doing his schoolwork with the incomplete focus of a boy who found arithmetic less interesting than most other things. "The main part," Elowen said. "Did we win?" She considered this. "We kept what was ours, and we made it harder for anyone to do this to someone else. Is that winning?" "It's close enough," she said. Orrin thought about it and went back to his arithmetic, satisfied. Harlan sat across from her and looked at the letter on the table between them. "I want to say something," he said. She looked up. He had not planned this. He had thought about it, argued with himself about it, set it aside, picked it up, and ultimately arrived at this moment without a prepared version, because every prepared version had felt false. So he said it plainly, because plain was what he had. "I came here in June to take your farm," he said. "Not maliciously, I want to be honest about that. I came because you owed a debt, and I had a legal right to collect it, and I didn't think about much else." He paused. "And what I found when I got here changed things for me in ways I didn't expect and didn't plan for." She was very still, watching him. "I'm not talking about the cooperative," he said, "or the legal case, or the spring. I'm talking about you." He kept his eyes on her because looking away would have been cowardice. "I'm talking about watching you drive a grain wagon to Dunmore and catch an arithmetic error in a buyer's ledger before his own clerk did. I'm talking about the letters you'd already sent to the land office before I even showed up. The way you talked to Rufus in the street." He paused. "The way you are with your children. Harlan, let me finish. I want to get it out before I think too much about how to say it and end up not saying it." He took a breath. "I have been very careful for a very long time about not wanting things I couldn't quantify, about not building toward anything that didn't have a clear return. And I understand now that I did that because I'd been hurt and I didn't want to be hurt again. And being careful about everything was easier than being careful about the right things." The kitchen was very quiet. From somewhere in the house, one of the twins was laughing at something, and then the laughter stopped and the quiet returned. "What I want," he said, "is to be in your life in a real way. Not as the man who holds notes, not as a business partner, as someone who shows up." He paused. "If that's something you'd want. I'm not asking you to, Harlan." Her voice was quiet, but it stopped him. He looked at her. She was looking at him with an expression he hadn't seen before. Not the careful reading look, not the ledger accounting look, not the controlled against breaking look she'd worn in the early days. Something more open than any of those, and more careful too, in a different way. "I know what you're saying," she said. "I've known it was coming for a while. I'm not subtle." "You're very subtle. You think you're not." A pause. "You fix fences before sunrise so nobody has to ask you to. You hand a stick back to a screaming baby 14 times without losing patience. You told Rufus Dane in front of witnesses that it wasn't about what the spring was worth to you." She folded her hands on the table. "A person pays attention." He waited. "I have 5 children," she said. "The oldest doesn't trust quickly, and the youngest won't remember anyone who isn't permanent. I have a farm and a cooperative and a legal case that still has civil proceedings pending, and She stopped, looked at the table for a moment. "I have not been good at wanting things either." After Silas. "It felt like wanting things was what got you hurt when they didn't work out. I know that feeling. I know you do." She looked up at him. "I'm not saying no. Something shifted in him. Not dramatically. Just shifted. I'm saying," she continued, "that I need it to be real. I need it to be not perfect. I know you're not perfect. I'm not either. But I need it to be honest. And I need it to be slow enough that the children can find their footing. And I need you to understand that what comes first for me, always, is them. I understand that. Tessa needs more time, I know. She might need a lot of time. I have a lot of time, he said. I'm not going anywhere. She studied him, that reading looked but different now. Reading something she'd already mostly read and was confirming. All right, she said. All right. She picked up the confirmation letter from Caldwell and tapped it into alignment with the edge of the table, the way she organized things when her hands needed something to do. I'd like you to come to supper on Sunday, not for business. Just supper. I'll be here. The children will ask you questions. Orrin always asks me questions. Tessa might not. That's all right, too. She nodded, set the letter down, picked up the ledger and then set it back down again, which was the closest thing to flustered he'd ever seen from her, and he found it completely, inconveniently endearing. Go home, she said. You have your own operation to manage. Garrett manages it when I'm not there. Garrett is a foreman, not an owner. Go home. But she said it without edge. He stood up, got his hat, got his coat from the peg by the door where it had lived for 2 months beside the children's things without anyone commenting on it. At the door, he stopped. Elowen. She looked up from the ledger she'd opened, maybe actually reading it, maybe just needing something to look at. Thank you, he said, for letting me stay the first time. She looked at him for a moment. You invited yourself. I know. Thank you for not throwing me out. Something crossed her face that was unmistakably a smile. It lasted about 2 seconds, and then she brought it back. But he saw it, and it did something to the middle of his chest that he'd stopped trying to explain weeks ago. Sunday, she said. Sunday, he said, and went out to find his horse. He rode back toward his own property in the late afternoon, with the sky doing something complicated in orange and gray above the ridge, and the grass at the edge of the track still showing the dry gold of the season's end. He rode without hurrying, because there was no hurry now. There hadn't been a hurry for a while, but it had taken him some time to understand that. He thought about Sunday. He thought about a kitchen table where important things happened. He thought about a wooden box above a door with documents in it that had changed the shape of things for several families and might change them for more. And he thought about the woman who had written those documents and organized those documents and sat across from adversaries at that table without moving back. He had come to this valley in June with arithmetic in his head and 17 years of careful distance between himself and anything that cost more than he'd budgeted for. He had, without planning it, spent everything he'd saved up in that distance on one farm, one spring, 5 children, and a widow who wanted partnership instead of rescue. He wasn't sure he could calculate the return on that. He suspected it wasn't the kind of thing you could put in a ledger. He thought that might be the point. Stockton moved at an easy pace along the familiar track, and Harlan let him pick his own speed, and the sky went from orange to something deeper. And somewhere behind him in the direction of the Wren farm, a light came on in the kitchen window, warm and steady against the coming dark. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. He knew it was there. Sunday supper was not what Harlan had expected, which meant it was exactly what it was. Elowen made a pot roast that had been going since morning. He could smell it from the paddock when he arrived. That particular smell of meat and root vegetables that meant someone had been cooking with intention for hours. The table was set with the everyday dishes, not anything special, which he appreciated because special dishes would have meant performance, and this was not supposed to be a performance. Orrin met him at the door before he'd finished tying Stockton. Mama said you're coming for supper, and not for business, Orrin announced. That's right. What's the difference? No ledger on the table. Orrin thought about this. There's still a ledger on the table. Mama moved it to the shelf, but I saw it. Then it's close enough, Harlan said. The twins materialized from somewhere behind Orrin and attached themselves to either side of the doorway like small sentries, watching him with the absolute frankness of 4-year-olds who had not yet learned that staring was considered impolite. Perry was on Elowen's hip when he came through the door, had deployed the scowl immediately upon seeing him, and then, after approximately 3 seconds of scowling, reached out one small fist and grabbed Harlan's coat lapel with the grip of someone making a claim. Elowen looked at Harlan over Perry's head. He does that to things he's decided belong to him. Harlan looked at the fist on his lapel. Is that right? Perry made a sound that seemed confirmatory and did not let go. Tessa was setting the table. She looked up when he came in, looked back down, and continued setting forks in the correct positions without speaking. He said her name quietly in greeting and got a nod in return, small, contained, but a nod which was more than silence. He sat where Elowen pointed and stayed out of the way of the cooking and the table setting and the complex management of 4 children in a small kitchen, which was its own system with its own rules. And he understood that his role in it right now was simply not to disrupt things he didn't yet understand well enough to help with. It was harder than fixing fences. He was better at things he could do than at things that required him to wait and observe and not fill silence with action. The meal was loud in the way. Meals with children always were. Cal spilled water and Elowen dealt with it without drama, with a cloth and a brief word, and the meal continued. Dory had opinions about pot roast that she expressed at length. Orrin asked Harlan 4 questions about cattle drives before Elowen said, "Let him eat, Orrin," and Orrin subsided, but kept looking at Harlan with the backed-up energy of a boy who had more questions ready. Perry ate with a seriousness that suggested he viewed food as a project. He had also, at some point during the meal, shifted from gripping Harlan's lapel to sitting in Harlan's lap, a transition that had happened in small increments that Harlan had not been able to identify as a single moment. And now there was a child in his lap eating pot roast from a small bowl with a spoon that was only partially successful as a tool. He looked at Elowen across the table. She was watching him hold Perry's bowl steady so it didn't tip, and whatever she saw made her look down at her own plate with a stillness that meant something. Tessa, from her end of the table, was also watching. She had Elowen's way of watching things quiet, thorough, filing it away. When Harlan caught her eye, she looked back at her food, but not quickly. Not guiltily, just went back to eating. After supper, after the children were in bed, a process that took longer than it seemed like it should and involved 2 trips back to the kitchen for water, and 1 extended debate between the twins about whose blanket was whose. Elowen and Harlan sat at the table. With the last of the coffee, and the house was quiet in the specific way it got after children were down, a kind of weighted quiet that had all their noise compressed into it. "Tessa watched you the whole evening," Elowen said. "I know. That's progress. Usually she watches for the first hour and then decides she's learned enough and stops paying attention. What does it mean that she kept watching?" Elowen wrapped both hands around her cup. "It means she hasn't decided yet, which is better than having decided against." He nodded. "She asked me something last week," Elowen said. "She asked if you were going to be around for a long time, or if you were going to be around until the cooperative got set up properly, and then go back to your own life." He was quiet a moment. "What did you tell her?" "I told her I thought you were going to be around for a long time. And I told her she could ask you herself if she wanted to know for sure. She hasn't asked. She will." Elowen looked at the table. "When she's ready." He looked at her hands around the cup. He had been thinking about things since their conversation 4 days ago, ordering them the way he ordered everything, trying to understand what he was walking into, and whether he was walking into it with clear eyes or with the particular blindness that came from wanting something. He thought he was seeing it clearly. He also knew that people who were not seeing clearly rarely knew it, which was an uncomfortable epistemological problem with no clean solution. "I want to talk to you about something," he said. She looked up. "I've been thinking about what makes sense going forward. Practically." He said practically because it was a word she understood and trusted, and because the practical and the personal were so wound together in what he wanted to say that separating them felt dishonest. "My property is 7 miles from here. That's manageable when I'm riding out regularly, but it's 7 miles in bad weather, and 7 miles when something goes wrong at midnight, and 7 miles when Perry spikes a fever and someone needs to go for the doctor." She was very still. He stopped, found the right words. "I'm not asking you to decide anything. I'm not asking you to move the children or leave this farm. This is their home and yours, and I wouldn't—" He stopped again, tried again. "I want to propose something." "All right. I want to build on the adjacent parcel to the north of your property. There's 60 acres there that came available last spring, and I've been looking at it for grazing but haven't moved on it. If I build there a proper house, not just a bunkhouse, I'm a 1/4 mile from your fence line instead of 7 miles. He paused. "That means I'm close without crowding what you've built here. You keep your home. I have mine. And the distance between them is something we both decide what to do with." Elowen looked at him for a long moment. The lamp was low between them, and the shadows in the kitchen were soft, and the house had settled into its nighttime sounds, the creak of boards, the distant sound of wind across the fields. You already looked into whether the parcel was available, she said. Last week. You've been thinking about this since before Sunday. I've been thinking about it since August, he said honestly. I just didn't know how to say it. She studied him. Not the quick reading look, the longer one, the one that went underneath the surface of things. You're building a house a quarter mile from my fence line before we've had a formal conversation about what we are to each other. I'm building a house near someone I want to be near. The formal conversation. He paused. I wasn't sure what to call it. I still don't know exactly what to call it. But the house seems like the right place to start. Elowen set down her cup. You could also just ask me to marry you, she said, if that's what you mean. The sentence sat in the kitchen between them. He had not expected her to say it outright, and the fact that she had direct, no decoration, was so entirely like her that he didn't know whether to be surprised or not. I thought it was too soon, he said. Maybe it is. She looked at the table. But I'd rather know what you mean than guess at it. He looked at her, at the careful ledger on the shelf, at the wooden box above the door with its stack of documents that had changed the shape of so many things, at the woman who had sent letters to the land office before he'd even arrived, who had corrected an arithmetic error in Calloway's ledger, who had stood in front of Rufus Dane in the street and named the things she knew with the calm of someone who'd already done the math. I mean to marry you, he said, if you'll have me. Not to rescue anything. You're past rescuing, and you know it. Not because of the farm or the cooperative or any piece of this that has papers attached to it. He paused. Because I want to be in the same life as you. Long term. Permanently. Elowen breathed in slowly through her nose and out again, the sound of the house settling around them. The farm stays mine, she said. Not a question. Always. The cooperative stays as under my management. Always. The children's decision, school, work, who they become, those are mine to guide. Yours. Though I'd like to be part of it. I know you would. She looked at him. That's not why I said it. I said it because those are the terms, and I need them said out loud, not just understood. Then they're said out loud. She was quiet for a moment. A long moment. He waited, because there was nothing else to do. Yes, she said. I'll have you. He let out a breath he hadn't fully known he was holding. Not immediately, she said. In the spring, maybe. After the second wheat planting. After we see how the cooperative's winter season goes. After. Elowen. She looked at him. Spring is fine, he said. I'll build the house. She looked at him for another moment, and then something in her face opened. Not broke. Opened, like a door that had been shut for too long. Finally being pushed by someone patient enough not to rush it. It lasted only a moment, and then she brought herself back to the same composed expression. But he'd seen it and he thought he understood it, and he didn't say anything about it because it wasn't the kind of thing you said anything about. Build the house, she said. Build it well, I intend to. And for now, she stood up and started collecting the cups from the table. Supper on Sundays. Sundays, he agreed. He rode home in the dark with the stars very clear, and the cold coming in properly, now that November had turned the corner toward December, and he thought that he had just made the best decent life, in a kitchen, over cold coffee, without a single piece of paper between them. The house went up through December and January. Harlan had good workersmen. He'd employed long enough to know their strengths, and he was on the site more days than not because he didn't trust them, but because he wanted to build this with his own hands as much as was practical. And there was something clarifying about physical work on something that meant something. He and Elowen argued about the kitchen. She came to look at the framing in January, came with Oren, who inspected everything with the authority of someone who'd been on construction sites before and had opinions, and she stood in the space that would be the kitchen and told him it was too small. It's a standard kitchen, he said, for a man living alone. You said you wanted to be part of the children's lives. Children happen in kitchens. She walked the space off. This is 12 by 14. Mine is 14 by 16, and it barely works. I can move this wall. He looked at the framing, and this window needs to face east. The east-facing window is in the bedroom. Then move it. He looked at the carpenter, who was studiously examining his own boot. What do you think? Harlan asked him. I think, the carpenter said carefully, that the lady knows what she wants. The wall moved. The window moved. The kitchen ended up 14 by 18, which was larger than necessary for a man living alone. But then, Harlan thought, he was not building a house for a man living alone. Oren, during the construction, had appointed himself unofficial liaison between the job site and the farm. He arrived on his mare Prudence Most Saturdays, she'd gotten used to him by now and only had opinions about the pace when she was heading home, and he would spend the morning examining what was new and reporting back to his mother with the thoroughness of someone who took his responsibilities seriously. Harlan began leaving the obvious things for Orrin to find, the things that would translate well in a report, and occasionally the things he was less sure about, because Orrin asked questions that sometimes landed on real problems. It was Orrin who noticed that the barn drainage was sloped the wrong way. "The water's going to go toward the foundation," he said, standing in the barn frame with the informed frown of an 8-year-old who'd spent 2 years watching his mother manage a farm. The carpenter checked it. He was right. 2 hours of work fixed what would have been a year of problems. "How did you know that?" Harlan asked him, on the ride back to the farm that afternoon. Orrin shrugged. "Mama says watch where water wants to go. Water always knows where it's going even when you don't." Harlan thought about that for a while. February came, and with it the civil case that Caldwell had been building since November. The two families whose water rights had been taken, the Holts and a family named Prentice, who'd come forward in December after Callum, of all people, had mentioned the case at the feed store, were seeking redress through the territorial court. The case named Dane Livestock Associates in Aldrich, who was suspended but could still be named in civil proceedings. It was not a clean case. Clean cases did not exist in territorial courts in 1889, or possibly anywhere. There were procedural delays, a change of judge in January that reset several motions, and a filing error by Greer apparently attempting a reappearance that Caldwell caught and had stricken from the record with what Harlan thought was some satisfaction. Elowen appeared at the courthouse in February to give a deposition. Harlan rode with her. They left the children with Vera Beckwith, who had offered without being asked and seemed to view the whole legal proceedings with the grim approval of someone who had waited long enough for things to go right. The deposition was conducted by Caldwell, who asked questions Elowen had seen in advance, and by opposing counsel, who had not read her correctly, and therefore spent 40 minutes asking questions. She answered with a precision that made Caldwell's note-taking unusually slow. He kept stopping to write something extra. At one point, opposing counsel said, "Mrs. Wren, isn't it true that without Mr. Voss's financial backing, none of these proceedings would have been possible?" She looked at him steadily. "Without Mr. Voss's backing, the infrastructure would have been slower, and the legal costs would have required different financing arrangements. The proceedings themselves are possible because the facts exist and are documented. The facts existed before Mr. Voss arrived. But practically speaking, water flows downhill regardless of who pays to document it," she said. "The spring was there before any of us. What I did was understand what it was worth and protect it appropriately. The financing helped me do that faster. It didn't create the underlying reality." Opposing counsel moved to a different question. Harlan, seated at the back of the room, wrote nothing and said nothing, and thought that he was going to be listening to this woman say clear things in difficult rooms for the rest of his life, and considered that a significant piece of good fortune. The court ruled in March. The Holt family received a monetary settlement and a formal acknowledgement that their water rights sale had been conducted under fraudulent documentation. Not enough to fully restore what they'd lost, but a record that established the truth of what had happened. The Prentice case was referred to a secondary proceeding that Caldwell said was likely to resolve similarly within 6 months. Rufus Dane paid the settlement through Dane Livestock Associates without appearing in person. His lawyers submitted this payment and a statement that contained no admission of wrongdoing, which was the legal version of leaving a room without looking at anyone. In April, he sold his Dunmore property. The sale was handled quietly, the price not publicly known, and he was gone before the summer wheat was planted. Some people said he'd gone to Colorado. Some said Kansas. Nobody in the valley went out of their way to find out, and the absence of him took up no more space than his presence had, once the valley adjusted. Harlan's house was finished on the 1st of April. He moved in with almost nothing because he owned mostly land and cattle and equipment, and a house full of empty rooms was not a problem he intended to solve alone. He brought his books, which were not many. He brought the roan gelding Stockton and the 2 other horses he rode regularly. He brought his saddlebag, which still contained the original 900 note from Silas Wren, folded into the inner pocket, where he'd put it the day he'd found the boundary discrepancy. He had thought sometimes about burning it. He hadn't burned it. He wasn't entirely sure why until he sat in his new kitchen on the first night in the house, with the east-facing window showing him the direction of the Wren farm a quarter-mile away, and understood that the note was not a bad thing that needed destroying. It was the beginning of a story that had ended somewhere entirely unexpected, and destroying the beginning to get rid of the bad parts would take the rest with it. He kept it in his desk. They married in May, a month after the second wheat planting, on a Saturday morning with Caldwell and Vera Beckwith and the Soto family, and Pruett and Ellis Beckwith, and 3 other families from the cooperative as witnesses. No ceremony beyond what was legally required. Elowen had been direct about that. She'd had a church wedding the first time, she said, with a dress and speeches, and all the formal weight of public promises, and she would rather this one be private and honest and real. It was in the yard of the Wren farm, because it was her farm, and that was where it should happen. Tessa stood beside her mother in a dress that was the best they had, not new, but clean and pressed with the kind of care that meant something. She did not smile during the ceremony, but she stood straight, and she held her mother's hand when Elowen reached for it, which Harson saw and filed away as something he would not forget. Orrin stood beside Harlan because someone had told him that's what people did, and he'd decided it was appropriate and positioned himself there without being asked. He was wearing his good shirt, which he'd buttoned wrong in the second buttonhole and which nobody had corrected, because it would have taken longer to fix than the ceremony. The twins stood together and were mostly quiet, which was unusual enough that Vera Beckwith later said she'd found it more remarkable than the wedding itself. Perry, 18 months older than the baby Harlan had handed a stick back to 14 times in a farmyard that seemed like a different era, stood on his own 2 feet in the grass and watched the proceedings with the serious attention of a child who was too young to understand what was happening and old enough to understand that it mattered. When it was done, when the papers were signed and the thing was real, and permanent, Harlan looked at Elowen beside him, and she looked at him, and neither of them said anything for a moment, because there was nothing to say that wasn't already said, and they were both people who understood that. Then Orrin said, "Can we eat now?" And the moment passed into something easier, and Vera Beckwith produced food from somewhere because she had clearly planned for this, and the yard filled with the noise of people who had come through something difficult together, and were now, briefly, just having a meal. The years after that were not uncomplicated, because nothing was uncomplicated, and anyone who tells you otherwise is selling you something. Harlan's transition from pure cattle operation to diversified farmland did not go smoothly. He lost money in the first year on a crop rotation he'd been too confident about, and Elowen sat with him at his kitchen table, at their kitchen table now, in the house with the east-facing window, and went through the numbers with him, and did not say she'd told him so because she hadn't told him so. But she had the expression of a woman who had thought it. The second planting should compensate, she said, if the summer holds. And if it doesn't, then we figure out what we do next. She looked at him. That's how farming works. You know this. I know cattle, he said. Cattle and crops are different. Yes, she said. They are. You'll learn. He learned, not quickly, not without more expensive mistakes. But he learned, the way people learn things they care enough about to stay with through the failures. The cooperative grew. Not explosively. Elowen would not have wanted it to grow explosively, and the structure she'd designed required expansion to be absorbed at a pace that kept the agreements functional rather than aspirational. But by the second in summer, it had 8 member properties, and by the third it had 14, and the storage pond that had taken 6 weeks to frame had 3 sister ponds in other locations. Each one managed through a branch agreement that referenced the original terms Elowen had written in pencil at the kitchen table. She had been right about one thing she'd said when she designed it. People copied it. Vera Beckwith helped 3 families in the next county design a similar structure around a different water source. Pruett, who had been skeptical of anything he hadn't thought of himself, ended up explaining the cooperative model at the Stockmen's Association with the enthusiasm of a man who had decided he'd invented it. Elowen did not correct him. She was practical about what mattered. Tessa came around slowly, which was the only way she was ever going to come around in the right way. It took the better part of a year of Sunday suppers and Saturdays on the construction site, and one particular afternoon in October, when Tessa was showing Harlan a problem with the garden's south bed, and he'd said the wrong thing about the soil drainage, and she'd corrected him flatly, and he'd said she was right without making anything of it, and something in that exchange had shifted something in her. She was 12 by the time she started coming to him directly with questions instead of through her mother. Questions about the farm, about the cooperative accounts, about how territorial land law worked, about what he'd done when things went wrong in his operation. She asked with her mother's precision and waited for complete answers. He gave her complete answers because she was asking complete questions. "She's going to do something important," he said to Elowen one evening, not as a compliment but as an observation. "I know," Elowen said. "I've known since she was 6. What do you think it'll be, whatever she decides it is?" A pause. "She gets that from me." "And the stubbornness?" Elowen looked at him. "Also from me." "That's what I thought," he said. Orrin grew into the ranching life with the enthusiasm of someone who'd decided the thing belonged to him. He was at Harlan's operation more days than not by the time he was 12, and Garrett, who had taken him seriously since the day Tessa told him about the grade line, treated him as a working member of the crew rather than a child being humored. He made mistakes. He was told about them directly and expected to fix them. He did, and came back for more work, which was the only measure of a person's seriousness that actually meant anything. The twins grew into their own shapes, quieter than anyone had predicted, Dory louder, both of them with their mother's way of noticing things and their own individual uses for what they noticed. They filled the space of the household with the ordinary, necessary noise of people becoming themselves. Perry, who had no memory of the time before Harlan, because the time before Harlan was the time before his own memory, called him Papa, without self-consciousness or deliberation, the way children named things that were simply true. The first time he said it, he was 3, and he said it while holding up a stick he wanted Harlan to look at, as if the matter of kinship was incidental to the more pressing issue of the stick. Harlan picked him up and looked at the stick as required, and did not say anything about the word because Perry had already moved on. He said it to Elowen later, when Perry was asleep. "He called me Papa today." She was at the ledger. She was almost always at the ledger in the evening, and she looked up. "I know," she said. "He's been doing it for 2 weeks. I was waiting for you to notice. He thought about that. You didn't tell me. I wanted you to hear it for yourself." He looked at the desk across the room where the 900 note was folded inside a book he kept there. "I've been thinking," he said. "About what?" "About the note." She waited. "I want to give it to Perry someday, when he's old enough to understand what it is." He paused. "Not because it's money owed, it isn't owed, it was paid. But because it's where this started. His sisters and his brother can know that, but Perry doesn't have any memory of before. I want him to have the beginning of the story." Elowen set down the pencil. She looked at him with the open expression she'd been less guarded about showing him over the past 2 years, the one that appeared when he said something she hadn't expected and found more true than she'd have predicted. "That's a good thing to give him," she said. "He'll probably just wonder why his father kept a piece of paper in a book." "You can tell him I will," he paused. "When he's ready." She picked up the pencil and went back to the ledger, and he watched her for a moment, the familiar shape of her at the table, the way the lamp fell across the page, the sound of pencil on paper that had become one of the fundamental sounds of his life, the way wind and cattle and early mornings had been before. He thought about the man who had ridden up this valley 14 months ago with a debt note, and the certainty that certainty was all he needed. He thought about what that man had understood about himself. Not much, it turned out. The confident clarity of a person who has built walls they call principles and convinced themselves the walls are load-bearing. You found out what was actually load-bearing when something came along that was worth taking the walls down for. What he'd found when he took them down was that he'd been holding himself away from the thing he'd actually needed. Not safety, not distance, not the clean arithmetic of ledgers and terms. Just this. A table with papers on it, and children in the rooms beyond, and a woman across from him who had enough spine for both of them, and the grace to offer him a share of her life on her own terms. He had come to collect a debt. He had found something he didn't have words for, that were small enough to say out loud, so he didn't try. He lived inside it instead. Outside the east window the night was clear and cold, and the stars over the Wyoming ridge were the same stars they always were, indifferent to the particular human arrangements below them. The spring in the eastern pasture ran in the dark, as it had run through every drought and every winter and every season of human trouble and human recovery since before any of them had been there to name it. The cooperative would hold its 3rd annual meeting in the spring. Elowen had already drafted the agenda. He'd seen it on the shelf. with her careful handwriting and her column-straight lines. 3 new families applying for membership, 2 infrastructure projects proposed, a discussion of expanding the remediation documentation for the Prentice case into a more formal record. She would sit at the front of that meeting and run it the way she ran everything, without theater, without apology, with the particular authority that came from being the person who had done the work and kept the numbers and told the truth when the truth was inconvenient. He would sit nearby and say very little, and think that there was no version of himself that would have imagined being here, in this place, in this life, in the specific company of this specific woman. He thought about all the people who built things in this territory, ranches, operations, empires of cattle and land that sometimes lasted and sometimes didn't, depending on drought and market and the particular failures of ambition. He had built something like that himself, 17 years of it, and he was not unproud of it. But he understood now that a thing built by one person for one person had a ceiling, and the ceiling was the size of that person's understanding of what was worth building. What Elowen had built and what he was now part of had no ceiling he could see, because it was not built for one person. It was built for the valley, for the families who would use the water through dry summers he would never see, for the children sitting in the rooms beyond this kitchen who would carry forward the understanding that help and independence were not opposites, that strength was not the refusal of partnership, that a debt could be the beginning of something better than what either person was carrying when it was made. You did not have to be perfect to build something that lasted. You had to be honest about what it cost, and willing to pay it, and stubborn enough to stay at the table when the work was hard. He knew that now in a way he hadn't known it when he rode up that drive with arithmetic in his head. He knew it because she'd shown him. He got up and poured himself the last of the coffee, which was cold, and drank it standing at the east window, looking out at the quarter-mile of dark between his house and her farm, and at the light still burning in her kitchen, and at the Wyoming sky doing what it always did, enormous and unimpressed and quietly magnificent above everything they had made and broken and rebuilt between them. It was enough. More than enough. It was, as it turned out, exactly what enough felt like.